The wind was brisk in downtown Chicago that evening, whistling through the narrow alleys and weaving between the high-rise buildings. Mark Harrison adjusted his tie and straightened his jacket as he stood outside the Grand Regency Hotel. The gala was in full swing inside, the muffled sound of a live jazz band trickling through the grand double doors behind him. Mark had worked security for years, and he prided himself on maintaining order and professionalism, qualities he believed set him apart. Tonight was no different. The line of attendees dwindled as most guests had already entered. Mark studied each person, nodding politely as he checked the guest list on his clipboard. Then, James Carter appeared. Dressed in a simple black suit and wearing an air of calm confidence, he approached the entrance, his hands tucked into his coat pockets to fend off the chill. Mark's brow furrowed slightly as he sized him up. Something didn't sit right. "Good evening," James greeted with a small smile, extending his invitation. Mark barely glanced at the paper. "I'm sorry, sir. This is a private event." James's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, I'm aware. That's why I'm here. My name is James Carter." Mark flipped through the guest list, a performative gesture. "I don't see your name here." "That's impossible," James replied, keeping his voice steady. "I was invited personally by Clara Thompson. I believe she's the organizer." Mark's grip tightened on the clipboard. "I'm afraid I can't let you in. This is an exclusive event, and we're very strict about who gets access." James hesitated, his calm demeanor starting to crack. "I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding. I don't want to cause trouble, but if you could just check with Ms. Thompson." Mark cut him off. "Sir, I need you to step aside. You're holding up the line." His voice carried a sharper edge now, one that drew the attention of other guests still lingering nearby. A few curious glances shot toward the commotion. James took a deep breath, visibly trying to stay composed. "This isn't about the list, is it?" His question hung in the air, the implication unmistakable. Mark stiffened. "Excuse me?" James's voice was firmer now. "I've seen that look before. You've already decided I don't belong here." The accusation hit like a slap, but Mark refused to back down. "This has nothing to do with whatever you think this is about. My job is to ensure only authorized guests enter, and you're not on the list." End of story. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the laughter and music spilling from the party inside. James stepped back slightly, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the polished marble facade of the hotel. "Fine," James said, his voice quieter now. "But you might want to let Clara know that her guest is standing out here." Mark crossed his arms. "I suggest you leave before we have a bigger problem." James shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "You're doing a great job at keeping things in order, Mark," he said, reading the name embroidered on the man's jacket. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his shoulders squared but his strides slower than before. Mark watched him go, feeling a fleeting twinge of discomfort. It was gone as quickly as it came. He was just doing his job, wasn't he? He turned back to the clipboard, brushing off the encounter as a minor hiccup in an otherwise smooth evening. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere was electric. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the elegantly dressed crowd, and the air buzzed with the hum of conversations and clinking glasses. At the center of it all stood Clara Thompson, her sequin gown catching the light with every step she took. She was beaming, basking in the success of the evening. "This turnout is incredible," Clara said to one of her colleagues. "But the highlight of the night is still to come. James Carter's speech is going to leave everyone inspired." Her colleague raised a glass in agreement. "He's done so much for this city. Honestly, he's a hero." Clara smiled. "He is, and tonight we're making sure he knows it." Minutes later, Clara took the stage, her presence commanding immediate attention. The room quieted as she tapped the microphone, her bright smile welcoming the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight," she began. "This event is more than just a celebration. It's a testament to the power of community and the individuals who make a difference. Tonight, we honor someone who embodies these values, James Carter." A round of applause erupted, but Clara's smile wavered slightly as she scanned the crowd. Her eyes darted toward the entrance, searching for a familiar face. The applause faded, replaced by murmurs as guests exchanged puzzled looks. "James?" Clara called into the microphone, her voice tinged with confusion. She stepped aside, whispering urgently to one of the event staff. Meanwhile, outside the hotel, James stood beneath a street lamp, his hands in his pockets and his expression unreadable. He glanced back at the entrance, the warm light spilling out onto the cold pavement. For a moment, he seemed frozen, caught between frustration and something heavier, resignation, perhaps. Inside, the murmurs grew louder. Clara's colleague leaned toward her. "Where is he?" "I don't know," Clara said, her voice tight with concern. "He was supposed to be here an hour ago." Mark, still stationed at the door, heard the commotion inside and felt a pang of unease. He turned toward one of the servers carrying empty glasses back to the kitchen. "What's going on?" "They're looking for someone," the server replied. "The guy they're honoring tonight. James Carter." Mark's stomach dropped. The name echoed in his mind, dredging up the image of the man he had sent away just moments ago. The blood drained from his face as he pieced it together. No, it couldn't be. But it was. The clipboard slipped from Mark's hand, clattering to the ground as he bolted toward the doors. Bursting into the night air, he scanned the street frantically. There, under the glow of the street lamp, stood James. Mark approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mr. Carter." His voice was shaky, the authority it usually carried now replaced with a desperate sincerity. I didn't know. I made a mistake." James turned slowly, his expression guarded. "A mistake," he repeated. Mark swallowed hard. "Please come inside. Clara's waiting for you. The whole room is waiting for you." For a long moment, James said nothing, his dark eyes fixed on Mark. Then, with a quiet sigh, he nodded. "Lead the way." The silence between them as they walked back toward the entrance was deafening, each step laden with the weight of what had transpired. Mark held the door open, but as James passed, he stopped and glanced over his shoulder. "You might want to think about how you see people," James said softly, "before you decide who belongs." Mark nodded, shame flushing his cheeks. "I will," he promised. As they stepped inside, the warmth and brightness of the ballroom enveloped them, but the tension lingered. For Mark, the night had just begun to unravel. The hum of the gala immediately died down as James Carter entered the ballroom. Heads turned, eyes widened, and a few whispers swept through the room like an unexpected breeze. Clara, still standing at the microphone, let out a visible sigh of relief as her gaze landed on him. She beamed and raised a hand to signal for attention. "There he is," she said, her voice warm but tinged with an undercurrent of nervous energy. "The man of the hour, James Carter." A wave of applause rippled through the crowd, but the mood felt slightly off, as if the attendees could sense something unspoken. James stood still for a moment, scanning the room. His composed exterior betrayed no sign of the frustration he had felt outside, but his deliberate pause was enough to set the audience on edge. He began walking toward the stage, his stride steady and deliberate. Behind him, Mark lingered by the doorway, as if tethered to the spot, his face pale and his hands clenched. As James approached, Clara descended from the stage, meeting him halfway. "James," she greeted with effusive warmth, clasping his hands. "I was worried something had happened. I was just about to send someone to find you." James gave a tight smile. "Something did happen," he said, his voice calm but pointed. Clara's smile faltered, her eyes darting to the nearest table, where several prominent donors sat watching intently. "We'll catch up later," she said quickly, her tone bright as she guided him toward the stage. "Everyone's eager to hear from you." Mark stood rooted to the spot near the entrance, his thoughts swirling. He had never felt this kind of shame before. Not the mild embarrassment of a mistake, but the heavy, suffocating weight of realizing he had wronged someone profoundly. James Carter wasn't just any guest. He was the guest. And Mark's actions had almost derailed the entire evening. "Mark!" A sharp whisper snapped him out of his trance. It was Tom, another member of the security team. Mark turned toward him, startled. "What? What happened?" Tom asked, his tone low but accusatory. "That guy, he's the reason for this whole event. And you?" Mark shook his head, his voice cracking. "I didn't know, Tom. I swear I didn't know." Tom gave him a hard look. Yeah, well, everyone knows now. You better hope he doesn't tell Clara, or you can kiss this job goodbye. Mark didn't respond. He just turned his gaze back toward the stage, where James now stood in front of the microphone. The room fell silent. James's voice was steady as he began, though it carried an undercurrent of emotion that hinted at the events preceding his arrival. Thank you, he started, his eyes sweeping the room. It's an honor to be here tonight, surrounded by so many incredible people who share a vision of progress and unity. This gala isn't about me. It's about us. It's about what we can accomplish together. A polite wave of applause followed, but the audience seemed to sense that James wasn't finished. His tone shifted, growing heavier. Before I continue, I want to share something that happened to me tonight, he said. His words were deliberate, measured, and the room stilled further, as though everyone collectively held their breath. When I arrived at the entrance, I was stopped, turned away. Actually, a ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Clara's expression froze, her smile stiffening as her eyes darted nervously toward James. He continued, undeterred. The reason? I wasn't on the list. His gaze flickered to the back of the room, where Mark still stood, barely breathing. Now, I understand that mistakes happen. We're all human. But it reminded me of something important. How quick we can be to judge, to assume, to dismiss without looking deeper. The murmurs grew louder, a few faces turning toward Mark, who wished he could melt into the polished marble floors. He tried to step back, but his legs felt leaden, as if guilt itself had rooted him in place. James pressed on. I don't bring this up to assign blame. I bring it up because it's the perfect example of why we're here tonight. The neighborhoods I work in, the communities I serve, these are places full of people who are dismissed every day. People judged by where they're from, how they look, or what they have. And I think we've all been guilty of that at some point, myself included. His voice softened, but the weight of his words didn't. But here's the thing. Every person has a story. Every person has value. And sometimes, all it takes is a little compassion, a little willingness to listen, to see what's beneath the surface. The applause that followed was slow at first, but quickly built into something thunderous. James nodded humbly, stepping away from the microphone as Clara rushed back to the stage, her expression a mix of pride and apprehension. By the time James had taken his seat at the head table, Mark had retreated to the service hallway behind the ballroom. He leaned against the wall, his head in his hands, replaying James's words over and over in his mind. Mark, a voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Clara standing before him, her arms crossed. I'm sorry, he blurted out, his voice trembling. I didn't realize who he was. I was just following protocol. I didn't mean to. Clara held up a hand, cutting him off. Stop. Her tone wasn't angry, but it wasn't kind either. This isn't about whether you meant to or not. It's about why you did it. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't know what to say. I've known James for years, Clara continued. He's one of the most generous, patient people I've ever met. And the fact that he didn't make this about you tonight says a lot about his character. But let's be honest, Mark. What does it say about yours? Her words hit like a hammer. Mark looked down, unable to meet her gaze. I'll talk to him, he mumbled. You'll do more than that, Clara said, her tone softening slightly. You'll think about why this happened, and you'll figure out how to make sure it doesn't happen again. Mark nodded, his throat tight. Clara lingered for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the ballroom, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Hours later, as the gala wound down, Mark found himself outside again, the cold air biting at his face. He stood near the same spot where James had waited earlier, staring out at the darkened street. He was lost in thought when a voice broke the silence. Mark! He turned to see James approaching, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. I wanted to thank you, James said, for letting me in earlier, and for staying to listen. Mark shook his head, shame washing over him anew. I'm the one who needs to thank you. For being gracious. For not making a bigger deal of what I did. James studied him for a moment, then nodded. We all make mistakes, Mark. The question is, what do we do with them? Mark nodded, swallowing hard. I want to be better. I don't want this to define me. James smiled faintly. It doesn't have to. Just make sure it leads to something good. With that, James walked away, leaving Mark alone in the cold night, but not without hope. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he had something more to strive for. Not just order, but understanding. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the wide glass windows of the cafe, where James Carter sipped his coffee. He preferred mornings like this, quiet, reflective. Yet, despite the calm surroundings, the events of the previous evening weighed heavily on his mind. His phone buzzed with a new notification, the screen lighting up with articles about the gala. Words like visionary, hero, and community leader peppered the headlines. But James wasn't smiling. The gala had ended on a high note, but the humiliation of being turned away lingered. Not because it was the first time, it wasn't, but because of how predictable it felt. The man outside, Mark, hadn't said anything new, hadn't done anything James hadn't seen a dozen times before. It was the consistency of these moments, the exhausting repetition, that gnawed at him. A voice pulled James from his thoughts. "Mr. Carter?" He looked up to see Clara standing near his table, holding a small cup of tea and looking tentative. "Clara," James greeted, standing to shake her hand. "Good to see you. I hope I'm not intruding," she said, sitting across from him without waiting for an answer. I wanted to talk about last night." James leaned back, studying her. Clara was polished, composed, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Go on." "I spoke with Mark after the gala," she began, stirring her tea unnecessarily. He's mortified as he should be. But I think it's important that you know, he's not a bad guy. He's just someone who made a mistake." James's brow furrowed slightly. "I'm not interested in labeling Mark, Clara. I care about what's behind the mistake. Why someone like him, someone tasked with creating a safe environment, sees people like me as inherently unsafe." Clara shifted uncomfortably. "I don't think it's that simple." James raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it?" The question hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Clara exhaled slowly. "Look, I know what he did was wrong, but Mark's not the only one who needs to reflect on their assumptions. I watched a lot of people in that room last night, people who didn't know you were the honoree, react when you walked in. The whispering, the looks, it wasn't just Mark." James nodded, her words affirming something he already knew. "You're right," he said, his tone soft but firm. "It's never just one person. That's why I do what I do." Clara looked down at her tea, silent. Then, as if summoning courage, she asked, "Do you think you'll talk to him again?" James's lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe, but I think it's more important that he decides what comes next." Mark spent the morning pacing his small apartment. The guilt from the previous night sat like a stone in his chest, refusing to budge. He replayed James's words in his mind, over and over. Every person has value. Every person has a story. It wasn't just what James had said, it was how he had said it. There was no anger, no need for vengeance. Just truth, delivered in a way that was impossible to ignore. Mark glanced at the folded brochure on his kitchen counter, the one he had grabbed on his way out of the gala. It was for the new community initiative James was launching. Training programs, mentorships, opportunities for people like him to find better footing in their lives. Mark hadn't meant to keep it, but now it felt like a lifeline. Finally, he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. James was at one of his community centers that afternoon, walking through a converted warehouse that now served as a hub for education and skill building. He paused to watch a group of teenagers coding a robotics project under the guidance of an instructor. Nearby, a single mother attended a resume workshop, her toddler playing quietly with donated toys in the corner. The sight filled James with pride. This was the heart of his work, the reason he got up every day. But his contentment was interrupted when he heard someone call his name. "Mr. Carter." James turned to see Mark standing near the entrance, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. He looked out of place against the vibrant energy of the center, but there was a determination in his stance that hadn't been there the night before. James approached slowly, curious. "Mark, I hope I'm not interrupting," Mark began, his voice steady but low. I needed to see you." James crossed his arms, leaning against a nearby table. "What for?" Mark hesitated, glancing at the activity around them. "To apologize," he said finally. "Properly this time, and to tell you that I get it now. Or at least, I'm starting to. James raised an eyebrow. Starting to? Mark nodded. Last night, I was so sure I was doing the right thing. Following the rules, keeping things orderly. But the truth is, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just protecting my own assumptions. James watched him for a moment, weighing his words. That's a good start, he said. But understanding is one thing. What are you going to do with it? Mark looked down, visibly grappling with the question. I don't know, he admitted. But I want to learn. I don't want to be the guy who keeps people out because of what I think I see. James studied him, his expression softening. That's why this place exists, he said, gesturing around the center. For people who want to learn, to grow. It's not just for the kids or the families. It's for anyone willing to take a hard look at themselves and decide they can do better. Mark's eyes flicked around the room, taking in the faces of people working, learning, and connecting. Do you think I could? James interrupted gently. That's not for me to decide. It's up to you to show that you're serious. But I'll say this. If you're willing to do the work, there's always room for another hand here. Mark nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Thank you. For everything. James smiled faintly. Don't thank me yet. Just show up. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Mark returned to the community center. He didn't have an appointment or a plan, just a determination to start somewhere. He was greeted by a volunteer who showed him around, introducing him to the programs and opportunities available. For the first time in years, Mark didn't feel like he was just clocking in and out of a job. He felt like he was part of something bigger, something meaningful. And though it was just the beginning, he knew he was on a path he couldn't turn back from. Over the next few weeks, Mark became a regular presence at the community center. At first, he volunteered in small ways, organizing supplies, setting up chairs for workshops, or handing out snacks during tutoring sessions. He kept his head down, unsure of his place among the volunteers and attendees who moved with purpose and ease. But gradually, he began to engage more deeply, learning the rhythms of the center and the stories of the people it served. One of the first conversations that struck him came during a quiet moment in the corner of the library. A teenage boy named Elijah, who often spent hours there studying, sat across from Mark during a break. You're new here, Elijah said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Mark nodded, folding his hands. Yeah, just trying to help out. Elijah tilted his head, appraising him. Why? Mark hesitated. I guess. I've got a lot to learn. Figured this was a good place to start. Elijah snorted. You mean you messed up, and now you're trying to fix it? Mark's face flushed, but he managed a small smile. Yeah, that's about right. Elijah leaned back, crossing his arms. What did you do? Mark hesitated again, but realized he owed the boy honesty. I judged someone important, and I was wrong. I don't want to do that again. Elijah studied him for a moment longer before nodding. Good, he said simply, picking up his book and returning to his studies. James, meanwhile, had been keeping a distant but watchful eye on Mark's progress. He didn't want to interfere, believing that Mark's journey had to be his own. But when one of the center's program coordinators, a woman named Lila, mentioned that Mark had been asking insightful questions about community engagement, James decided it was time for a conversation. Mark, James greeted him one afternoon as they crossed paths in the center's main hall. Mark straightened, clearly still nervous around James. Mr. Carter. James shook his head, smiling faintly. Call me James. Right, Mark said, awkwardly shoving his hands into his pockets. What can I do for you? I wanted to check in, James said, leaning casually against a nearby wall. How's it going? Mark took a deep breath. It's humbling, he admitted. I thought I knew a lot about people, about what's fair, what's right. But I've been realizing how much I've missed, how many assumptions I've made. James nodded, his expression encouraging. That's part of the process. Recognizing the blind spots, Mark hesitated before asking, how did you get started with all this? The centers, the programs? James smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. It started small. I grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities were rare. A teacher once told me that if I didn't see the resources I needed, I should create them. That stuck with me. So when I had the chance, I started building. Mark listened intently, feeling a sense of awe. I don't know if I could ever do something like that. You don't have to, James replied. It's not about starting a movement. It's about showing up, being part of something bigger than yourself. Mark nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. I want to keep showing up, he said finally. I'm not sure where it'll lead, but I know I need to keep going. James studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. Then we're glad to have you. Mark shook his hand firmly, feeling a sense of connection and purpose that had eluded him for years. As Mark continued his work at the center, he began to form relationships with the people there, relationships that challenged and reshaped his worldview. He bonded with Elijah, helping the teen navigate his college applications, and connected with a single mother, Maria, who juggled work, classes, and raising her 2 kids. One evening, after a particularly busy day, Mark sat in the break room with Lila, the program coordinator. She poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the table to him. You've come a long way, she said, smiling. Mark shrugged. I've still got a lot to learn. Lila chuckled. We all do, but you're asking the right questions. That's what matters. Mark sipped his coffee, then asked hesitantly, do you think someone like me can really make a difference here? Lila raised an eyebrow. What do you mean, someone like you? You know, Mark said, gesturing vaguely. I don't have a background in this. I'm not an activist or a leader. Lila leaned forward, her expression serious. Mark, making a difference isn't about titles or experience. It's about showing up, listening, and putting in the effort. If you're doing that, you're already making a difference. Her words struck a chord, and Mark nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. One day, as Mark was helping set up for a community event at the center, he noticed James standing off to the side, watching the preparations. Mark walked over, curious. Something on your mind? Mark asked. James smiled faintly, just thinking about how far this place has come, and how far it still has to go. Mark nodded. It's incredible what you've built. I can see why people look up to you. James's smile turned wry. Don't put me on a pedestal, Mark. I've made my share of mistakes. Mark looked surprised. Like what? James shrugged, assuming I knew what people needed without asking. Thinking I could solve every problem on my own. It took time to realize that the best solutions come from collaboration, from listening. Mark considered this, feeling a sense of kinship. That's what I'm trying to do now, he admitted. Listen more. Judge less. James clapped him on the shoulder. Then you're on the right track. By the end of the month, Mark felt like a different person. His time at the center had opened his eyes to the complexities of the world and the importance of empathy. But more than that, it had given him a sense of purpose. One evening, after a long day of volunteering, he stepped outside and found James locking up the center. Heading out? James asked. Yeah, Mark replied. Then he hesitated. James, I just want to say thank you for giving me a chance to be part of this. James smiled warmly. Thank yourself, Mark. You're the one who showed up. As they parted ways, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He knew he still had much to learn, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the path to something meaningful. Months had passed, and the community center had become a second home for Mark. His work there had gone beyond simple volunteering. He had become an active mentor, working directly with people from all walks of life. The once shallow understanding he'd had of others had deepened into genuine empathy. One crisp autumn afternoon, the center was buzzing with activity. The main hall had been transformed into a bustling space for a career fair, an event James had envisioned years ago but had only now brought to life. Booths lined the room, offering job training, interview tips, and networking opportunities. Mark stood at one of the booths, helping a young woman perfect her resume. I think this is ready, he said, handing the paper back to her. You've got everything they'll want to see. The woman smiled, her face lighting up with gratitude. Thank you. I didn't think I'd ever figure this out. Mark smiled back, a quiet pride settling over him. Moments like this reminded him why he'd stayed. Across the room, James observed the scene, his arms folded. Clara stood beside him, a clipboard in hand and an amused expression on her face. You're staring at him like a proud dad, Clara teased. James chuckled. Not quite, but he's come a long way. Clara nodded. I remember the night you told me he'd joined the center. I wasn't sure it would stick, but now? He's one of your best mentors. James's smile widened. He reminds me that people are capable of change. Sometimes you just have to give them a reason. Later that evening, as the career fair wound down and volunteers began packing up, James found Mark sitting alone on a bench outside. The air was cool, and fallen leaves crunched underfoot as James approached. "Long day?" James asked, taking a seat beside him. Mark nodded, leaning back and exhaling deeply. "Yeah, but a good one. Feels like we made a real difference today." "You did," James said. "I saw you helping that young woman earlier." She left with a smile on her face. "That's the kind of thing that changes lives." Mark glanced at James, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief in his expression. I used to think all of this was, I don't know, just stuff people said to feel better. Helping others, giving back. It felt abstract. But now I get it. It's real." James smiled. "It is, and it's contagious. You've inspired people here, Mark. More than you realize." Mark's throat tightened at the unexpected praise. He looked down, his voice softer now. "You gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one. I'll never forget that." James shook his head. "You earned it. You showed up, and you did the work. That's all anyone can ask for." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the last of the volunteers left for the night. Then Mark turned to James, a question lingering in his eyes. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if things had gone differently that night?" Mark asked. James considered this for a moment. "I try not to dwell on the what-ifs, but I do think about the lessons we take from moments like that. For me, it's a reminder to keep building, keep reaching people. And for you, well, you've shown what happens when someone chooses to change." Mark nodded, the words settling over him like a warm blanket. Months later, Mark's growth came full circle during a citywide event hosted by the community center. This time, Mark was the one welcoming guests at the door, shaking hands, and ensuring everyone felt valued as they arrived. He stood proudly in the entranceway, a stark contrast to the man who had once used the same position to turn people away. As the evening unfolded, James took the stage to deliver a speech. He began by thanking the community for their support and celebrating the center's success. But as he reached the heart of his speech, he paused. "There's one story I want to share tonight," James said, his voice steady. "It's about a man who started out as part of the problem, but through humility and determination, became part of the solution." The audience was silent, their attention riveted on him. "This man came to me after making a mistake rooted in judgment and assumption. But instead of running from it, he faced it. He didn't just apologize, he changed. And in doing so, he reminded me of why we do this work. Because people can grow. They can surprise you." In the crowd, Mark felt his chest tighten. He wasn't mentioned by name, but he knew James was speaking about him. The weight of the moment, the acknowledgement, the forgiveness, the hope was almost overwhelming. James ended his speech with a call to action. Let's all be part of that change. Let's listen, learn, and lead with compassion. Because that's how we build a better future for everyone. The room erupted in applause, and Mark found himself clapping along, a smile breaking across his face. As the event wound down, James found Mark once more, standing near the door where he had started the evening. "Nice work tonight," James said, clapping him on the back. Mark grinned. "Couldn't have done it without you." James shook his head. "You did this, Mark. You chose to show up. That's what matters." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm still figuring it out, who I am, who I want to be." James smiled. "That's the beauty of it. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to keep going." As they parted ways that night, Mark felt something he hadn't in a long time. Pride, not just in what he had done, but in who he was becoming. The story ended not with grand gestures or dramatic conclusions, but with quiet, steady growth, the kind that lasts. Mark, once lost in his own assumptions, had found purpose in helping others. And James, ever the visionary, had proven once again that change starts with seeing people, not for what they appear to be, but for who they truly are. Together, they had turned a moment of misunderstanding into a movement of connection, proving that redemption is always within reach for those willing to seek it.